Hi, I'm Christopher Ray, and welcome to the second of 3 video lectures about Dung Kai-cheung's novel Atlus, The Archaeology of an Imaginary City. In this lecture, I want to use the concept of the palimpsest to interpret Atlus. I think that one of the things that Atlus does is that it uses maps, and maps were originally written on parchment. And so we have layers of maps being accreted over the course of this work. And I think that we could use this as a metaphor for some broader explorations of culture, memory, and time. So a palimpsest creates multiple layers of partially visible inscription. And so we have a city, V City or Victoria City, which is being inscribed in different ways, including on maps, these abstract representations. And I want to move from that to talking about how you could view Hong Kong as a place that, for its literary field, has its own palimpsest. It accretes different voices and different writings. Beyond the literary sphere, we could also see how cities and maps themselves can be read as palimpsest, and that if you have certain memory or knowledge of the earlier map, you may be using that to read the new map. So palimpsest is a concept that we can use to interpret cities and other places and how they accrete and lose meanings, how some things cover up other things. But I think more broadly, we could take the palimpsest as a way of reading that calls for a type of multiple vision. So a palimpsest has multiple texts on it, you could say, and therefore you can't read it just once. A dictionary definition of palimpsest is writing material like a parchment or a tablet that has been used one or more times and has been partly erased and written over. A broader definition would be something, really anything, that has multiple layers which have been partially erased but are still partially visible. So something that doesn't just have a surface, but also has something below the surface. So there's a broad array of potential associations and implications here. Anything that bears different types of writings or layers of meaning could be considered a palimpsest. It could be regarded as akin to sedimentary layers, right, where there's one layer and then there's another layer on top of it, and you may have bedrock underneath or you may not. But those sands and those layers may shift over time. They may not be flat. They may be very, very uneven. Palimpsest is also a process that takes place over time. You have repeated writings and erasure. And so there's a reuse of old materials and an addition of new materials. So we can find literary examples of palimpsest as a metaphor to express a type of abstract idea. So for example, in Fortress Besieged, another novel that we cover in this course, Mrs. Chung spoke Shanghainese better than her husband, but her native accent often showed through like an undersized jacket that doesn't cover up the gown underneath. That would be a type of sartorial palimpsest being used as a metaphor for a linguistic palimpsest. You can also see palimpsests in architecture, where there are multiple time frames of construction and destruction that are visible at a single time within a building, say. And beyond the individual building, one could say that all cities or places are palimpsests, and that if you look at the cityscape, or if you just look at a single street, you can see the existence of different generations of construction and destruction simultaneously. The metaphor of the palimpsest could also be applied to a nation or a society, as the writer Margaret Atwood has done. And to bring this a little closer to home, the experience of being an individual might also make people think of the palimpsest, and that as you live, you accrete these different experiences and memories, and these memories are constantly being partially erased, and new ones are replacing or covering over them, but only partially. And so we become aware that we are also accretions of multiple types of inscriptions, as if we are the parchment being written on. So we can see that in Atlus, Victoria City is being read by this impersonal first-person narrator as a place of many different layers. There are different eras of history that are being read. There are different parts of the map. So we go from city streets to different lanes to an airport, mountain, water, all of these different parts of the map. We have different layers of maps, different layers of other texts, and different layers of meaning that are being accreted or are disappearing over the course of the work. So we have different degrees of fact and fiction intertwining here, and therefore I think that part of the palimpsest is not just things, it is also this active interpretation, and that different modes of interpretation are constantly being displaced by others. But of course, we still carry with us the memory, at least partial, of some of what we've already read. If we step back from this novel for a moment and look at the Hong Kong literary field in general, we could see that Hong Kong's, like any literary field, is also a palimpsest. That's not just local writers, but I want to mention a few of them here. In the case of Hong Kong, the literary sphere is quite diverse. We have several different languages, we have domestic and global muses, we have colonial and post-colonial time frames and power structures. We also have different media. So although this particular course is focused on the form of the novel, we also have newspaper serializations, we have books, we have cinema, screenplays, operas, songs. We also have Hong Kong writing being done both inside and outside of Hong Kong. by long-term residents, sojourners, and people who have never visited the city. The best-selling writer of all time is probably this man, Louis Cha, better known as Jin Yong, the so-called king of martial arts fiction, whose cultural impact has gone far beyond Hong Kong, although that's a place where he did most of his writing. He was a newspaper magnate, but he was best known for doing these long serialized martial arts novels that have been adapted into video games, stage plays, movies, TV shows, and everything in between. We have Sai Sai, also known as Xi, who has written dream tales, poetry, and surrealistic works of fiction. Leung Ping-Quan is a distinguished and versatile writer of poetry, fiction, essays. He's a scholar of the cinema and literary culture, as well as a food lover. Many of his works appear under the pen name Yesi, which sounds like the English word yes. Shi Shuqing would be an example of one of the many sojourner writers who came to Hong Kong. In her case from Taiwan, she wrote a Hong Kong trilogy, which has been partly translated as City of the Queen. Then you also have Anglophone writers and writers in other foreign languages, such as the Indonesian-American Hong Kong writer Xu Xi. And these are just a few of the writers in this tremendously diverse literary sphere. Literary imaginings of Hong Kong have also been shaped by works like The World of Susie Wong, this Orientalist sexual fantasy, as well as epic works of historical fiction set during the colonial era, such as James Clavell's Taipan. So Hong Kong's literary sphere is a palimpsest, and some of that literary imaginary, like the Susie Wongs, is very hard to erase. But we could look at the place of Hong Kong itself as a palimpsest in a broader sense. Hong Kong is a palimpsest at the street level, with constructions from different historical periods, or even down to the double-decker trams that still carry the memories of the British colonial past in present-day Hong Kong. Hong Kong has also been inscribed by different political eras, the pre-colonial era, the British colonial era that's had such a tremendous influence, and now we're in the era of Hong Kong being a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China. And things seem to be changing very, very quickly. And one can only speculate at what the post-one country, two systems policy and period is going to be like, one that is allegedly going to start in 2046. Every place, you could say, is also a palimpsest. Scholars have now taken all of the historical maps of Taiwan and created this digital humanities project where you can layer the different maps one on top of another. So you have a Japanese colonial era map. You can look at a satellite image of the same area today, but you can also look at maps from the Japanese Meiji era, where you have entire sections of Taiwan that are unmapped, that are blanked, that have yet to be filled in. In Atlus, I think that Dung Kai-cheung is not just applying the concept of the palimpsest, he is also critiquing its misapplication. So there's this chapter on geological discrimination, and you could, of course, take the term discrimination in a couple of senses. So one is this notion that this Victoria City, or Hong Kong in disguise, has accreted different layers, that you maybe have like a bedrock layer, the oldest layer there, and then these different layers of sediment. And he critiques these Bantu, or native soil ideologues, who claim to be indigenous, and that later generations are just the sediment on the top layers. He also critiques this self-flattering notion that to be a Hong Konger is to be hybrid and cosmopolitan, and a mix of many different things. So palimpsest in this novel, I think, does emerge as a type of reading, an act of reading, and that it's also a sensibility. Not everybody can see all of these different layers. And so he's helping to reconstruct them and to kind of model some of the different possibilities for us. He says at one point in the Subtopia chapter, the act of reading an ancient map, and I think you could say any map really, is inevitably a process of unearthing, for every ancient map is bound to be covered by another more recent one. So the type of reading that we have to do when we're dealing with maps and with places is to use multiple vision. Either we have to read that place again and again to try to uncover the different layers, or we have to have this kind of dual or multiple vision to see the different layers simultaneously. And this is not just a neutral project. I think that the V-City project that Dung Kai-cheung is doing is to rebut these ideas that Hong Kong is a place without history, that is a place without culture, that is a borrowed place in time. Instead, I think Dung is making several implicit claims with this archaeology. One is that Hong Kong is indeed multi-layered and complex. It can't be reduced to a single layer like just the colonial era or just a post-colonial era, that it is multiple things at once. I think he's also saying that Hong Kong identity is not a singular thing. It has multiple coordinates. So it shouldn't be defined in relation to just one historical time period or one colonial power or post-colonial power. More fundamentally, I think he's also arguing that Hong Kong is not just a physical place, but also a place of the imagination, and that all of these attempts to define Hong Kong definitively are actually very arbitrary, unstable, subjective, and often self-serving. So Hong Kong is a fiction, but it is a fiction with meaning and value. So the meanings of Hong Kong are not just multiple, but they are also actively created. including by novels like Atlus.